All right, so we're starting a new book of the Bible. It's actually not new, it's a few thousand years old. Judges in the Old Testament. So if you have a Bible with you, would you turn to Judges chapter 1? And there's ushers coming down the aisles if you don't have a Bible. And we're going to cover the whole first chapter and a little bit into the second chapter. So you want to get a Bible so you can read along. If you don't have one, you can borrow one or keep it. Judges chapter 1, and we'll go through chapter 2, verse 5 today. I've been excited for this. Do any of you, when you start, like if you go buy a novel and you start to read a book, do you ever start reading it and then flip to the back to find out what's going to happen? Anybody who does? My youngest daughter does that every single time. We're like, what are you doing? I want to find out what happens. Well, actually, that is really helpful here in the book of Judges. So could you turn to the last verse just for a moment? It's Judges 21:25. We'll copy my daughter here this one time because this summarizes the book of Judges for us. It'll be helpful to you. And we'll have it up on the screens for you. Here's what the writer said. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You might want to just let that one kind of sink in for a moment because there's a summary. Everyone did what their own eyes is the key. You know, I don't think that they necessarily set out to do wrong. I think that they're trying to do right, but it's just like our culture today. Our culture is trying to do right in their own eyes, in their own way. You know, think about the political things that are going on in our country. And the moral things and the spiritual things. When people are doing it, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it if they weren't doing what they thought was the right thing to do, you know. But here's the problem, then and now, is that if God is not the foundation of things, if he's not the basis, then it leads to chaos in a culture. And moral decline, spiritual bankruptcy. And that's certainly what we're headed towards in our country, unfortunately. And that's what's happening in Israel in the book of Judges. And so what I did is I called this message, Just Follow Instructions. Because that's really the answer to everything. We need to follow God's instructions. And there's like a sub title, I guess, that you would say, it's you can't negotiate with the flesh. You can't negotiate with the flesh. You see, God just wants you and I to do what he tells us to do, and if we will, then things will turn out better. You see, God's desire is that you would work with him, not against him. And so, in order to accomplish that, in this section of Scripture, I've broken it up into three parts because we're going to get three basic directions to help us to follow instructions, okay? And we'll start, and we'll have the outline for you on the screens. We'll start with the first one here in verse 1 of chapter 1, and I call this Finish What You Started. Okay, so we're going to learn from the tribe of Judah to listen to God, and then finish what we've started. So here's what the writer said. Now after the death of Joshua, it came to pass that the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, Who shall be first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? Okay, so just a little background. You know, the book of Judges takes place over 1,000 years before the time of Christ. We just finished the book of Matthew, so that was the time of Christ. So this is 1,000 years before that. And in addition to that, it covers about 4 centuries of time. From Joshua, as we see, the death of Joshua, to King Saul. Right, the first of the kings in Israel. So that time period, and during that time period, a lot of stuff happens, as you can imagine. I mean, our country isn't even that old. So, Judges highlights a lot of that stuff. So there's a lot of cool stuff. There's all this intrigue and romance and spies and adventure and military conquests. But the primary focus is on 12 people, these 12 judges. Now, don't get confused. It's not like Supreme Court justices, somebody in a black robe and, a judicial kind of a judge. The word there that's used is more like savior, or I think of it as hero, if you can kind of imagine that. These heroes were the unofficial leaders that God appoints to help the people from the situation that they get themselves into. Because here's really the sad part of it. Israel just goes through this sad cycle about 7 times in the book of Judges. And we have a graphic on the screen for you there where, it starts off, they disobey God. They don't follow instructions. And so they fall into sin. And then when you fall into sin, then you're in bondage to it. You're in bondage to the enemy or yourself, doing things wrong. And so, of course, then that's when people cry out to God for help, and that's what they do. And so God, because he's gracious, he helps people. And so he sends these heroes one after another, and he saves them, delivers them from their situation. And then there's this time of peace. While that judge, that hero is alive, there's a time of peace. But then the judge dies, and then the cycle starts all over again. So this is like the dark ages of Israel's history. We could title it, This is Not the Way, Don't Walk in It. That would be a good title for the book of Judges, because it emphasizes the Jews' failure to remain loyal to God. And for us today, this is really helpful for the church, because there's 2 big ideas here that can help you and me right now. And the first one is it's a warning of what not to do. So we can take these lessons, especially today, and know this is not what I'm supposed to do. And just as important, a second one is if you're in that cycle, how to break free of it. Because sometimes we get in those and we don't know how to get out. And we're going to talk about how to get free. And really, what it boils down to is what I've already said, and it's just follow instructions. It's very simple. It's not easy sometimes, but it's simple. So we see here now we've arrived at the Israelites are in the promised land, and they've had a lot of victories, and there's this relative peace for them there. But there's pockets of enemies in the land still, and they haven't dealt with them. And so that's what we're going to look at here in our chapter. And so what they do is they do right here in verse 1. They're like, let's do what Joshua would have done if he were alive. And let's ask the Lord who should go fight against the Canaanites. So they do that, right? Well, let's see what God says. Verse 2 through 4. It says, and the Lord said, Judah shall go up. Indeed, I have delivered the land into his hand. So Judah said to Simeon, his brother, come up with me to my allotted territory, that we may fight against the Canaanites. And I will likewise go with you to your allotted territory. And Simeon went with them. Then Judah went up, and the Lord delivered the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and they killed 10,000 men at Bezek. Okay, just something to note here. You may know this already, but some of you may not, so I want to help you understand some things. When the writer is talking about Judah and Simeon, he's not speaking about individuals. It may look like that because it's the type of figure of speech that he's using, the writer. But those 2 sons of Jacob have been dead for hundreds of years at this point. So he's not talking about individuals. When it mentions those guys, or Benjamin or Dan, the others that we see in this chapter, it's talking about the 12 tribes of Israel. And he's talking about actually areas that they dwelt in, that they were allotted to them. We actually have a map of it that you can take a look at. I don't know how well you can see this, but here's the map of the 12 tribes. You might just note this. Remember how it's kind of laid out. God divided this promised land into these various parts for the 12 tribes. And so, when you hear about Ephraim or Manasseh or Benjamin and Simeon and so forth, now you kind of know where they're at between the north and the south and the central part of Israel. And they are supposed to defend those areas, right? Keep the enemy out. So they go to the Lord, and the Lord chose who there? Who did he choose? Chose Judah, right? But Judah says to their neighbor Simeon, come and help us. And they go fight together, and they win big. So it's got to be of the Lord, right? They won, and they won big. Maybe. We're not sure. I'm not sure. Some commentators are really sure that this is right and good. I'm not so sure, because God said Judah, but they go get Simeon. And I think what's happening here is they're not completely trusting God by following instructions. Now, nothing big happens here, but this is a pattern that follows the rest of the chapter, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And so we're sort of tipped off here, I think, by being careful to not do what God tells us to. God chose Judah, but they go get reinforcements instead. So let's look at verses 5 through 7 together. It says, and they found Adonai-Bezek in Bezek and fought against them, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. Then Adonai-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. We'll get back to that in a minute. And Adonai-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off used to gather scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. Then they brought him to Jerusalem, and there he died. Well, that's a little strange, isn't it? You haven't seen nothing yet. Judges has all kinds of odd things. And this is a really good book. The Old Testament is helpful to understand it, because often this is where somebody who's like an agnostic or searching or an atheist, like I was at one point, they will attack the Old Testament. And we need to understand why these things are here and what was happening and what God thinks about it, so that as like an apologetics type thing, so we can have an answer for the hope that lies within us. So it's good when we go through, like Judges, to help us to be able to, move people to understand and then share the gospel with them. And so, but this is a little strange right off the top here, where why is he cutting off? Why are they cutting off his thumbs and big toes? That's kind of weird. I was thinking about my dog when I was reading this, because she doesn't have any opposable thumbs. So she's dependent upon me to turn on the faucet to get her water, and like she can't get her food and do those kind of things, because even if she knew how to do those things, she has no thumbs. And that's the idea here. They would cut them off because now you can't draw your sword. You can't shoot a bow and arrow without thumbs. And you can't like push off in a battle without big toes, and running would be difficult. So it hinders what a man could do, right? But the reason it's happening to him, did you see, is because he had done it to 70 kings before. Isn't that interesting? So he gets what's coming to him. You guys, the Bible teaches the principle that people reap what they sow. There's this old expression in our culture: the chickens come home to roost. And they do. Right? You reap what you sow. There's consequences for your actions, and that's what's happening to him. Sometimes, like this guy, people think that they're getting by with it. But they're really not. Either something will happen to them, or certainly God knows those things. I was thinking about if we could just imagine a man who's a serial womanizer. And it's all about his own pleasure. He doesn't care. He just uses women, whether it's somebody who's married or single or has a boyfriend. He doesn't care. He just wants to please himself and then toss her aside and then use up the next one. And he's thinking that he's getting away with it. I'll just do whatever I want. But sooner or later, that's going to get him. some angry husband or something like that. And certainly God knows what that guy is doing, because you reap what you sow. And that's why, and I'm speaking to my brothers and sisters, God urges us believers to sow to the Spirit, doesn't he? Sow to the Spirit. Things like this, gathering together to worship and hear the word, and opening our Bibles at home with our family and with by ourselves, to pray, to fast, to give and serve, all those things. We're supposed to sow to the Spirit, because if you will, then you will reap great blessings from the Lord. And you'll keep your thumbs. But he didn't, right? Verse 7 says he died. Well, now I'm going to read starting in verse 8. It says, "Now the children of Judah fought against Jerusalem and took it. They struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire." This is way before Jerusalem becomes the spiritual capital of Israel. That begins later in the time of the kings, David and so forth. But right now it's sort of like it's not there yet. It's inhabited by others, and it will be. Well, I'm going to read down to verse 15 if you'd follow along. It says, "And afterward the children of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites and dwelt in the mountains in the south in the low land. Then Judah went against the Canaanites who dwelt in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kirjath Arba, and they killed Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. From there they went against the inhabitants of Debir. The name of Debir was formerly Kirjath Sepher. Then Caleb said, 'Whoever attacks Kirjath Sepher and takes it, to him I will give my daughter Aksah as wife.' And Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it. So he gave him his daughter Aksah as wife. Now it happened when she came to him that she urged him to ask her father for a field. And she dismounted from her donkey, and Caleb said to her, 'What do you wish?' So she said to him, 'Give me a blessing. Since you have given me land in the south, give me also springs of water.' And Caleb gave her the upper springs and the lower springs." Okay, this is actually retelling parts of the book of Joshua. You can find some of this in this chapter in Joshua 15, 16, and 17. And I think it's because the writer wants you to know how we got to this point, like setting some context, just like I do when I teach. I start off and I try to tell you what's been going on so we can get into what's happening now, And so it starts to talk about this guy Caleb and how he conquered this one city, and he did it in a unique way, didn't he? He found this brave soldier by saying, "Whoever takes this city can marry my daughter over here. Look at her, she's a beauty." Who wants to take this city? I have daughters, and I imagine a daughter going, "Dad," So then it seems like they come together, and because the guy wins, and so then she asks the dad for some more land. I mean, I'm imagining she might be thinking, "Well, you chose my husband for me, so can I get some land now to make up for that part or whatever?" But could be wrong. Anyway, so Caleb gets a twofer. He gets a strong son-in-law who's brave and a victory, right? Kind of interesting little section there. Well, now it says in verse 16, "The children of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the children of Judah into the wilderness of Judah, which lies in the south near Arad. And they went and dwelled among the people. And Judah went with his brother Simeon, and they attacked the Canaanites who inhabited Zephath and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city was called Hormah. Also Judah took Gaza with its territory, Ashkelon with its territory, and Ekron with its territory." Okay, so in summary form, you could say so far, so good. Because Judah is, for the most part, doing exactly what God told them to do. They're being faithful, right? They're clearing out the Canaanites from the land, all the way to the coast. That's where those places in verse 18, all the way to the coast, just taking care of it. And this is really helpful for us because they're an example of a people that believed God. And so because they believe God, they're following instructions. If I won't follow instructions that God has given me in his word, then I don't really believe him. The proof is in what I do. And so because they believe God, they followed instructions, and they are successful. And so this is a really good example for us to remember them before we move on here, because they start really well. And the question is, will they finish what they started, right? And it's the same thing for you and I, my friend. It's not how you start that counts. It's how you finish, right? You want to be faithful to God. And I pray that that's who we would be. Well, now actually trouble begins to brew. And so we're going to look at the second basic direction that's given here in our outline. And number 2 is don't make a treaty. Don't make a treaty. And this is where we'll spend most of our time here this morning. So this applies very much to us today in the church. Don't make a treaty. And he said this in verse 19. So the Lord was with Judah, and they drove out the mountaineers, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the lowland because they had chariots of iron. Okay, when it says there could not, it's more like would not. They would not because of fear. You see, what they did is they stopped because the technology of their enemy was greater than theirs. You know, iron chariots against them would be like a group of us trying to stop a tank today, you know, kind of like that. Now, they could have, and you know why they could have? Because God told them that he was with them through all of this, and he wouldn't lead them into this if he wasn't going to help them. Remember, Paul the Apostle said, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. We can, but they didn't think that was true. You see, what they did is the same thing that we can do, or I can do, is you get your eyes fixed on the problem instead of God, and then you start thinking, I can't do that. I mean, there's something right now before me, and it's a big thing. And because it's a big thing, I was convicted when I was reading this because I've had my eyes fixed on the problem instead of on God. And I need to fix my eyes on God because that sort of thinking will stop many of us right in our tracks. It makes us fearful. Like, I can't go on. What am I going to do? You know? But God doesn't want you to be fearful. He doesn't give us the spirit of fear. Well, verse 20 says, and they gave Hebron to Caleb, as Moses had said. And then he expelled from there the 3 sons of Anak. But the children of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. So the Jebusites dwell with the children of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Okay, it's already happening. Benjamin does not follow instructions completely. And because of that, they're living around the Jebusites for as far off in the future as they can see. You might take a note of how many times this sort of pattern repeats itself through this section that we're going to cover here today. It's just over and over again where they don't completely obey and trust the Lord, and so then it leads to problems in their lives, as it will with you and I. Now Joseph is next, and they're more like Judah. Look at verse 22. It says, and the house of Joseph also went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. Note that. So the house of Joseph sent men to spy out Bethel. The name of the city was formerly Luz. And when the spies saw a man coming out of the city, they said to him, please show us the entrance to the city, and we will show you mercy. So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword. But they let the man and all his family go. And the man went to the land of the Hittites, built a city, and called its name Luz, which is named to this day. Okay, so the tribe of Joseph is like Judah. They're faithful. And, they're like, okay, how can we apply, God is with us, and we know we're supposed to do this, so let's use our brains here. Well, there's a guy. Let's see if we can get this guy to help us, and they do, and he's a Hittite, and he goes off after he gives them the information, and they show him mercy, but they're able to do what God calls them to do. So we see a couple of faithful tribes, and they're examples for us to follow. And then we're going to see a bunch of unfaithful tribes, the rest of this chapter, and they're what not to do. However, verse 27, and here they go, Manasseh did not drive out the inhabitants of Bet-shean and its villages, or Ta'anak and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. For the Canaanites were determined to dwell in that land. And it came to pass, when Israel was strong, that they put the Canaanites under tribute, but did not completely drive them out. Okay, so it starts talking about this place called Bet-shean, and it's an example of a place where the Canaanites were allowed to remain. And actually, this place has been discovered. They when I was there, they told me that they were digging, or they were going to build a park in northern Israel, and they had the earth movers out there, and they started to work, and they started to uncover all of these archaeological artifacts, and they ended up, and we have a picture of it here, and this is what they found. The ruins there of Bet-shean are really impressive. Now, it's mixed together with a bunch of Roman stuff, because that's what happened in Israel. A lot of the Romans built on top of Jewish ruins, right? And so you have it mixed together like in that place there. But I wanted you to see this, and I'm stopping to talk about it for a minute, because this area that it's speaking of in verses 27 and 28 was an important trade route for that country. And so the Canaanites, as we see there, they were determined to stay there. Now here's the problem. Because you might be thinking, what's the big deal? Why don't you just let them stay? Well, God told the Hebrews that when they came into the land, not to allow the Canaanites to stay. And here's the reason: because of their abominations. Their abominations. You see, lots of people have a problem with God telling the Israelites to wipe out an entire people group or to clear them out of their country and so forth. But what we don't understand is what was going on then. The Canaanites and some of those groups, they did things like child sacrifices, just morally bankrupt people. And it's because they were worshiping false gods. And they were worshiping false gods, and it just polluted their whole culture. And so God doesn't want his people joined to them. And so he's like, I'm giving you this promised land, and it's your responsibility to follow instructions and clear them all out. But Manasseh there was content to just let them stay. They give up following the instructions. They're like, it's too hard. There's too many of them. So rather than do what God said, did you see what they did instead? They made him servants. They're like, I know. Let's use this to our advantage. We'll put them to work. We'll get them working for us. We'll have them pay taxes. Let's make some money off them. That's okay, right? No, it's not. Because God didn't tell them to do that. And God knows the future. And it leads to their moral and spiritual decline. And we got to take this to heart, you guys, because we think often, and I'm speaking for myself here too, that we think that we know what's best for us. We know who we should marry. We know where to work. We know where to live and all the things that we pursue. And I'll just figure out my own plan. And yeah, I love Jesus, but I got this. But actually, it's much better if God does all the guiding. And we can learn from these guys. Israel's undoing is right there in verse 28. They failed to follow instructions. They partially obeyed, but not completely. And they let their enemies hang around. And it's never good when you let your enemies hang around in this sense. And of course, with them, it was actually actual enemies. With us, it's a spiritual matter. And I'm not supposed to let the worldliness and the devil and my own nature just hang around. It's like sports. I'm kind of a sports fan. I'm not a huge sports fan, but I'm kind of a sports fan. And I've noticed that whenever a team is way out in the lead, and they don't finish off their opponent, oftentimes that team starts to come back late in the game, Like baseball. I love baseball. And I've noticed that, let's say, for example, that a baseball team is winning big, 10-1. And it's the 7th inning. So the game's almost over, and the leading team starts to horse around in the dugout. They're just laughing and, joking it up and everything. Whenever I see stuff like that, I usually turn to my wife and go, they're going to lose. And you know what? They often do, because they had this opportunity to put their opponent away by just keeping after it and finish what they started, and they don't. And the team comes back and beats them, and they're the ones who laugh last. And so here lies the problem. Number 2, as I said, is you can't make a treaty with the flesh. Don't try to do it. You see, the Bible teaches in the New Testament that the spirit and the old nature are contrary to one another. You guys that know Jesus, you've been born again, you've been given a new nature, but you still have an old nature, which is where sin comes into play and why you do things that you wish you wouldn't do, because that old man is still hanging around a little bit. And in order for you and I to have victory, we have to let God drive that out. But the flesh is determined, like Canaan, to stay put. It's sort of like old luggage. Any of you guys got some old luggage laying? I think I have a suitcase in my attic from 1985. I can't get rid of the thing. It's always kind of there. And, it's like it's just there. But they say, we will control it. We'll tax them. We'll make them servants. And, Christians do this sometimes to their detriment, and it leads to disaster. I have a friend who's a brother who came out of a life like I did of drunkenness. And, Jesus rescued him from his life of destruction and gave him a future and a hope and a family and a great job and a home and kids, and just praise the Lord. What a great, God brings beauty from ashes. Just stoked for the guy. But after a number of years of that, he started dabbling in alcohol again. And he's like, what's the big deal? It's not a sin for me to drink, is it? Well, no. But pretty soon, it kept growing. And then it led to something else, until finally it's affecting the marriage and his walk with Christ. And he gets in this spiral and can't get out. And it's like, it's just, I picture a toilet bowl flush, spiral going down the drain. And God doesn't want his people in a toilet bowl. But when you make a treaty with the flesh, that's what begins to happen. Making a treaty with the flesh is like dating a hot mess. Any of you ever dated a hot mess? Hopefully it's not the person you're sitting next to. I got a couple of hands. There's some honest people here. I had a couple bad dates before I met my wife. And I was thinking the other day, boy, am I glad I didn't marry that person. Can you imagine? And it's like, just that one thing can lead to a whole mess of problems. Well, God is telling us that you can't confine things to one little area of your life like this. Ultimately, you get in bondage to those things. So what are we supposed to do instead? Do we just come to church and complain about it? Maybe I can have you guys file up here and we can just all complain about this stuff, one after another, and then go home and we'll, yeah. Is that what we should do? No. Actually, the Bible provides a one-verse solution to this whole problem, and it's in the book of Romans, and it's the last verse in chapter 13, and we'll put it on the screen for you. It's Romans 13:14. And maybe we could all read this together out loud as a church. So let's read this. He said, "But put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts." Isn't that great? Let's read it again one more. Hopefully this will sink into me and you. One more time. "But put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lusts." Man, that is so great, because he tells you what not to do and what to do, you know? The Christianity is not just a bunch of don't touch it. It tells you what to do. Obviously, he's like, help me, Lord. I'm supposed to go, okay, I refuse to go that way. I refuse to do that thing. I refuse to talk like that. But I'm going to walk in the light of Jesus instead. Help me, Lord, to be that person. And then you know what? Problem solved. Problem solved. It's awesome. But Israel isn't doing that. Let's see what happens. Verse 29. It says, "Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites who dwelt in Gezer. So the Canaanites dwelt in Gezer among them." I'm going to be dwelling in Gezer here pretty soon. I'm in my 50s. "Nor did Zebulun drive out the inhabitants of Kitron or the inhabitants of Nahalol. So the Canaanites dwelt among them and were put under tribute. Nor did Asher drive out the inhabitants of Echo or the inhabitants of Sidon or of Alab, or the other 4 or 5 of them. They didn't. And so the Asherites, I'm going to have you guys come up and read these. You'll see what it's like. "So the Asherites dwell among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land, for they did not drive them out. Nor did Naphtali drive." You see what's happening here? "Drive out the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh or the inhabitants of Beth Anath. But they dwelt among the Canaanites, the inhabitants of the land. Nevertheless, the inhabitants of Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath were put under tribute to them." So he just, in summary form, tells us that 4 more tribes of Israel did not follow instructions either. And you know why? I think it was because it was too hard. Gezer has actually is an archaeological excavation. They've done extensive excavation of Gezer, and we have an artist rendition of it. I thought this would make more sense for you to see it like this, because it's kind of hard to tell when you're just looking at a pile of rocks. But it was a city on a hill. And this is what they did in that day. They would build up high, so it was easier to shoot down than shoot up, and it was easier to be surprised. There's only one way into that place, and it would be hard to overpower them because of those things. So what the Israelites chose to do in these cases is just let them stay. It's easier. It's too hard. Just like today, it seems like it's easier to not do anything about pornography or anger issues or gossip. But if you let those things hang around, it gets worse and worse over time. And by the way, God never said that it was going to be easy or happen quickly. He never told them that, and he hasn't told us that. These things were supposed to happen little by little over time and make some progress, just as like for your life, you guys. Some people give up because it doesn't happen immediately. It's like we've got apps. If I don't have an app for every little thing and I can get it right now, then we're like freaking out. But that's not the Christian life. The Christian life is a little progress every day. We're in for the long haul, and if we will obey instructions and and seek him for strength and power in that, you will. You'll look back and go, wow, I haven't swore in 2 years. Like, I'm a totally different person than I used to be, because it's a little bit every day. Well, look what happens next, verse 34. It says, and the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. And the Amorites were determined to dwell in Mount Heres, in Aijalon, and in Shaalbon. When the strength of the house of Joseph became greater, they were put under tribute. Now the boundary of the Amorites was from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. Okay, it's just getting worse, isn't it? Now the tribe of Dan aren't even allowed to go to the area that they've inherited from God. They can't even go to Home Depot down in the lowland. It's like they're being kept in the mountains. It's like the Amorites are just pushing them around now because they've allowed this to happen. And this is what happens in the life of one of God's people. It progresses like that. Pretty soon the flesh rules. But let me tell you this. I know this for a fact. God does not want you to be pushed around by sin and the devil and the flesh. He does not. And you won't be if you walk in the strength of the Lord. Remember Romans 13. So, I hope I've convinced you, don't make a treaty with it. This is so important for us today. But if you do, there's one more thing that we can guarantee will happen, and that's our third area here today. As we go into chapter 2, we're just going to look at 5 verses, and here's the third thing. Get ready for some crying. Get ready for tears, because this is what follows. And God doesn't want us to be like this. So let's see what happens to them. Verse 1 says, and the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim and said, I led you up from Egypt and brought you to the land of which I swore to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their gods shall be a snare to you. It's pretty well agreed upon by the scholars that this is a theophany. That means it's an actual appearance of God in the Old Testament, because oftentimes in the Old Testament you will read this phrase, the angel of the Lord. And so in those times, it seems like what God does is he puts on some kind of a form that we can understand, like an angelic form or a human form, and he comes to earth. This is different than like when Gabriel shows up or Michael, who are archangels. That's not who this is, because he refers to himself as Lord. God himself shows up. And so it's important when God himself shows up, right? And he says to him, what are you guys doing? What are you doing? You're settling for less. I promised to give it all to you. Why are you doing that? You see, their problem is one of devotion. They're aligned, their allegiance now, they don't even realize they're doing that, but it's with the enemy. By keeping the Jebusites and the Amorites and the termites around, they're like joining that team, because they're breaking the agreement they have with God. We had a covenant, So he said, they will be thorns in your side. What a bummer. Don't you hate to see that when someone is cooperating with the enemy, and then their life is just a mess, and they got thorns in their side and a snare, and he doesn't want people to live like that, and so it's unnecessary. And it's great to see this, because we don't have to be like that, and I'm just thank God for the wisdom that he gives us through his word. Well, at this time, I'd like to ask the worship team to come back up as we finish up our study. And as they do, let's read verses 4 and 5 together. It says, "So it was, when the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the children of Israel, that the people lifted up their voices and wept. Then they called the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord." So there's lots of sorrow now, isn't there? Lots of tears. But you know what? They really don't change. And folks are often really sorry when things are going bad about what they've done and so forth. But sometimes they're not sorry enough to change. And what God desires is change. Now, he's told us here how to do that. And I think I've mentioned it at least 10 times. And that's just follow instructions. It's right there. He tells us how to live, the basic instructions before leaving earth, the Bible. We want to follow it completely. What that means also is don't try to negotiate around it either. I've done my fair share of that. But if you try to negotiate like they're doing, you end up sorry for a long time. And it's because these things have consequences. You reap what you sow. And I'm not trying to condemn anyone. There's no condemnation for them that are in Christ Jesus. But there is sowing and reaping. And God doesn't want us crying in the future. Yesterday, when I was preparing, one of my daughters was listening to Christian hip-hop in the next room, and I could hear it, and she likes NF. You guys know who that is, NF, and Christian hip-hop guy. His name's like Ned Finkelstein or something like that, and he goes by NF. You would too if your name was Ned Finkelstein. And so, but she likes him, and he's got a good message. And I heard one thing, I remember one thing that he said, and he said, "We spend a lot of time crying over wasted time." And I'm like, whoa, preach it, brother. I wrote it down in my notes. We do spend a lot of time crying over wasted time, and it's unnecessary. So if you don't want to cry about it later, cooperate with God. One last thing, I have a quote from a guy named F.B. Meyer, a Bible teacher from long ago, and he said this: "There is a complete deliverance possible for all who will open their hearts to the might of the Spirit of God. He is able to drive the Canaanites from your life." Isn't that awesome?